Hey there, this is Lacey DeSherry recording our group presentation for Module 6, Learning, Teaching, and Development, along with Sandra DeTusa and Macy Richardson. I am going to go over adult development and cognitive learning in this presentation. Adult development we learned about in the readings from this week, and that is the systemic change within an individual or group of individuals that results from a dynamic interaction of heredity and environmental influences. And so basically, that is just saying that how a person changes over time due to nature and nurture. There are four primary models of adult development: biological, psychological, sociocultural, and integrative models. Essentially, integrative models brings together components of all the other three and talks about how they interact and impact one another. Biological is really the physical development of a person and what happens within their body and the impact of this on adult learning. Obviously, if one's health isn't good, then it impacts one's ability to take in new information. Same with neurological declines that can occur over time. This can impact one's ability to learn new information or recall old information or even process existing information. One interesting thing about the biological development is that in 1900, the life expectancy was only 49 years old. And in 2019, it's currently 78 years old. And so even within the last 119 years, we have almost doubled the life expectancy. And so there is a lot that we have come to learn about those additional 40 years and what aging actually does to a brain and one's ability to learn. The psychological development is really focused on the internal development aspects of faith, identity, and self-development. The primary theory here is Erikson's psychosocial stages. He does have 8 stages across the lifespan, but the last 3 that really focus on adult development are intimacy versus isolation, generativity and self-absorption, and integrity versus despair. And so intimacy versus isolation is really that milestone where one has to be able to make connections and build relationships. Generativity and versus self-absorption is really your ability to contribute to the rest of the world versus just focusing on yourself. And then integrity versus despair is that that last and final stage where you really want to give back to others, in a sense of accomplishment at the end of a life versus that sense of despair that life is over. So there are some other primary psychological theories of development that are also really important, particularly for non-majority members here in the US. And so that includes racial identity development. This is interesting when you put the privilege lens over it, because this is super important for the development of people of minority status here in the United States to come to terms with their racial group that they are a part of, understanding what that means for them, how do they connect with that group, how might they not connect with that group, and what does it mean for their race to be interacting with the rest of the world. And most people of color in the United States are forced into this development because they experience racism sometimes on a daily basis. And so they're really forced to reconcile what their racial identity development is and what that means for them. white people in the United States don't necessarily aren't forced in the same way to come to terms with that, but when they can develop that white racial identity and understand what it means to be white in the United States, how that contributes to privilege and systemic oppression, and then being able to come to terms with that and then help to dismantle some of the systemic oppression that's happened. That's also a key component of racial identity. Also in this category, gay identity development. So this is the process that a person goes through if they do identify as homosexual versus heterosexual. And so this process is identity confusion. So maybe the thoughts start of, okay, I may not be like my peers. Comparison, really starting to compare their likes and dislikes about their attractions toward other people, tolerance. And so this is where they come to terms with the fact that they may be identified as LGBTQ. And then once they come to terms with that and they determine whether they're going to have the social supports and go through that whole process with relationships, then they can come to pride and synthesis and really be proud of that identity and fully embrace that and be open with that. Biracial identity is something that's important to for people who do identify as more than one race. This is a whole process around not knowing is sort of the neutrality piece, not understanding that there is a difference, coming to terms with acceptance, awareness, experimentation. So do I really identify with one race over another race? Which cultures do I identify more with? Which pieces do I want to take with me? Which pieces do I want to not assimilate into my personal identity that are maybe true of the race identity that I come from? And then really owning that identity. And then women, there's also a specific development stages that emerge from women, particularly in midlife. And so that's perhaps women who come to midlife and sort of reject those stereotypes of being a stay-at-home mom, or really that the household duties are a primary role for their life, all the way through adjusting attitudes, behaviors, and circumstances to really shirking some of those stereotypes. Sociocultural is was the third model for development. And so this really includes the social constructs that a person grows up in. Transitions are key in this. And, just how do we interact with the society as it changes? And so this also has to do with social status, with class, with the groups that you're in, the regions of the country that you might live in, generational and historical considerations. And so there's a lot that really goes into socioculture. And then, of course, integrative models are the ones that kind of bring all of these together. And so they don't assume specific pathways, meaning that there could be multiple pathways to coming to one's own identity. And then we move into the cognitive development in adulthood. And cognitive is really more how thinking patterns change over time. And so this really occurs in the brain and how we take in and utilize information. The most prominent theory around development, at least for children's development, is Piaget. He identified 4 primary stages, developmental stages. And so that means that there's not like a clear cut, you move from one to the next. It's really sort of a transitional stage that sort of flows together. And so you can see those stages here. And then Perry's developmental scheme is really how a person shifts their perspective on what do I know, who are the authorities of information that I learn from, that I take truth from, which ones do I question, how do I assimilate that new information into my existing thoughts. And so this was primarily developed on white male college Ivy League students, and so it may or may not really effectively apply to all people, but certainly it is true for the group that he identified it with. And so um, is really just the way that a person can develop their thought patterns and their ways of knowing over time. And then the other primary model under cognitive development that we wanted to touch on was women's ways of knowing. And so the process through which women come to know was identified to be a little bit different than Perry's developmental schemes. And so the first stage is silence, and this is really women who experience themselves as mindless and voiceless and are subject to the whims of external authority. That is, they maybe feel passive, maybe feel like they don't really have a voice, maybe they feel like they are or view themselves as really submissive and subservient, and that their role is to be of service to those in power. And then once knowledge, the received knowledge stage is reached, this is where women really start thinking about themselves as capable of receiving and even reproducing knowledge. And so maybe they are able to take in information and understand that information and even give that information out, but not capable of developing their own information. Subjective knowledge, this is where women start to see themselves as people who can know things and have their own truth. And this is really where they start to gain a voice and be able to say whether they agree or disagree with the information that they have been given. Procedural knowledge, this is the fourth stage where women are really learning and applying procedures to learn new knowledge and be able to give back that new knowledge. There is equality between the self and the content of discussion. And so this is where women can really identify with the content and be able to discuss that, whether they agree with it or not. And then constructed knowledge is sort of this stage of wisdom that we'll talk about in a second, but really where women view all knowledge as contextual. They themselves can be creators of knowledge. They can create knowledge that is subjective or objective. And this is where women truly become authentic as learners and as knowers and able to give that information out to others. Some of the other key models under the cognitive development category are the epistemological model, which is really talks about 4 different ways of knowing. And so this is how people can come into knowledge. So there's the absolute, the transitional knowledge, independent knowledge, and contextual knowledge. And so those are all different ways that that are viewed for people to be able to come to know things. The transcendence view is really a focus on knowing that there is an existence beyond one's individual self and being able to tap into that sort of collective wisdom and unity that goes beyond physical structures of the human capacity and really taps into that collective consciousness that this theory or model purports that exists. So transcending beyond oneself into this higher human consciousness. Dialectical thinking is really this ability to respond to the fact that there are so many complexities and so many truth, like alternative truths or even contradictory truths that we have to sort through every day. And so one of the examples from the book was that you might be against, taking someone's life, but that you can understand how one might need to take a loved one off life support, even if they don't, even if you don't agree with the fact that that they might pass away. And so the dialectical thinking allows that room for contradictory thoughts and pathways. And then contextual perspective just takes into account social, cultural, economic forces. And wisdom is really interesting. It's really seen as the pinnacle or hallmark of adult thinking, and this balances decision making as a process rather than a stage. The last part of this perspectives on teaching is really around the different practices of teaching across countries. And so transmission, apprenticeship, developmental, nurturing, social reform. And